My name is Emily Ross, and I learned something critical while sitting at my family's mahogany dining table on a Friday evening in June. Some inheritances are stolen before you know they exist. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Stories like this require order, the kind of meticulous sequencing that would later become my profession. So let me begin where I spent most of my adult life, at the edge of other people's celebrations, smiling at precisely the right moments, contributing what was expected, and remaining invisible in the way that dutiful daughters often are. The dinner was held at my parents' home in Wellesley, a house that seemed designed primarily for the impression it made on others. High ceilings, recessed lighting, hardwood floors that reflected crystal chandeliers. My mother, Elaine, had spent 3 days preparing the space. Not the food, she had hired someone for that, but the presentation. Floral arrangements in the center of the table, fresh linens, the good china, the kind we weren't supposed to use because replacements were expensive and irreplaceable. My mother believed in the archaeology of objects. If something came from your great-grandmother, if it bore the patina of inherited respectability, then it mattered more than comfort or actual use. This belief extended to children as well, though she never would have articulated it that way. 23 people sat around that table, and 17 of them had come to celebrate my brother Andrew's college graduation. He had earned his degree from Cornell in business and economics, a path my father had laid out for him the way a general plans an invasion. Comprehensively, with resources allocated strategically, with success anticipated as inevitable. Andrew was the kind of young man who looked like success. Tall, with the confident posture that comes from never being told you're not good enough, with the kind of easy charisma that results from having every door opened before you reach it. He wore a suit that probably cost more than my entire summer wardrobe. His smile was natural and generous, because he had never needed to calculate whether he deserved to smile. I wore a navy dress I had bought on sale 3 years ago. It still fit perfectly because I had stopped treating my body as something deserving of change or renewal. Stasis seemed safer than aspiration. My father, Thomas Ross, stood at the head of the table, the position he held even when sitting down. He was a corporate attorney, the kind of man who saw the world as a series of precedents and strategies. He had built his career on the principle that words could be shaped to mean whatever served his purposes best. He was tall and distinguished, with gray threading through his dark hair in exactly the way magazines said men aged well. He was, by most measures of the world that mattered to him, a success. "I have a surprise for Andrew," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. He set down his wine glass with precision. "A house, or rather, a condo, in Boston. The down payment is my graduation gift to him. The property is already under contract. By August, he'll have his own place." The table erupted in the kind of exclamations that acknowledge both the generosity and the appropriateness of such a gesture. My mother smiled and reached over to squeeze my father's hand. Andrew's face colored with pleasure. He stood and embraced our father, and everyone at the table seemed to settle into the satisfaction of witnessing a moment of family harmony and parental love rendered in commercial real estate. I cut my salmon into smaller and smaller pieces. I had calculated this moment before it happened. The way you calculate many things when you've been calculating for years. My father's annual income was public knowledge, available in the corporate filings he submitted as an officer of his company. From those filings, I could extrapolate his expenditures, his patterns of generosity, the line between what he spent freely and what he kept guarded. I knew he had bought Andrew a car at 16, not the used Honda I had borrowed from a family friend when I needed transportation to my job at the grocery store, but a new Lexus, chosen to suit Andrew's aesthetic preferences. I knew he had paid for Andrew's tuition without Andrew ever having to take out a single student loan, despite the fact that Cornell was expensive, and my father's generosity was technically discretionary. I knew he had contributed substantially to Andrew's first apartment, his spring break trips, his wardrobe, his lifestyle. I also knew, with the precision that comes from handling other people's finances in my job as a junior forensic accountant, that my own education had been constructed from scraps. Community college for my first 2 years, taken while working full-time. Online classes completed late at night after my shift at the financial advisory firm, where I was learning the skills that would eventually make me valuable. Student loans that I was quietly servicing. The quiet accumulation of achievement that no one noticed because it did not announce itself at dinner tables. My Aunt Margaret was sitting across from me, and she was watching me watch Andrew. Margaret was my mother's sister, the one family member who had never entirely bought into the narrative that my father's version of the world was the only one that mattered. She had become a high school history teacher in Michigan, a decision my father had greeted with the kind of polite distance he reserved for choices he found financially unimpressive. But Margaret had a way of seeing. When she looked at me, there was no judgment, only a kind of steady recognition. She had raised 2 daughters of her own, and she had made sure they knew they were valuable in ways that couldn't be measured in tuition payments or real estate down payments. Our eyes met briefly. She knew I was doing the math. After dinner, after the dessert course had been cleared and the guests had begun their slow migration toward the foyer, my father pulled me aside. We stood in the kitchen, under the soft glow of the overhead lights. My mother was saying goodbye to the Hendersons at the front door. The caterers were loading their equipment into their van outside. "I need to talk to you about your living situation," my father said. He was using his attorney voice, the one that suggested he had already decided what was reasonable, and was simply informing me of the conclusion he had reached. "You're 26 now. It's time you contributed more directly to the household expenses. Starting next month, I'd like you to pay rent. Your room. We'll say $1,500 a month. That seems fair given the neighborhood and the amenities." I said nothing immediately. I had learned early that silence sometimes gave my father room to fill it with additional information he hadn't planned to share. "I'm not trying to be harsh," he continued, which is what people say when they are, in fact, being precisely as harsh as they intended. "But you're earning a decent salary now. You're a professional. It's time you stepped up. Your brother is getting out on his own. You should do the same." "I see," I said finally. "I'll need to think about my budget." "Well, don't think too long. I'm talking about next month, Emily. And I noticed you haven't finished your degree. I'm not going to keep subsidizing that indefinitely. If you want to complete your accounting certification, you'll need to fund it yourself. Your mother and I have expenses too, you understand?" I did understand. I understood that the house in Wellesley cost a certain amount to maintain, that private clubs had membership fees, that the life my parents inhabited, the life they had built carefully and protected fiercely, required money flowing in particular directions. I understood that I was being reclassified, from an asset that supported the household to an obligation that needed to be managed. "Of course," I said. He patted my shoulder, the way he might pat a colleague who had been reasonable in a negotiation. Then he walked back toward the living room, where the remaining guests were beginning to gather their coats. My mother emerged from the foyer. She did not meet my eyes. This was her way, to be present in the physical space of events while remaining entirely absent from their emotional truth. She had learned to do this so well that I sometimes wondered if she knew, in any real sense, what was happening in her own home. That night, I lay in my childhood bed in a room that suddenly felt rented. I had paid for my own car insurance since I was 18. I had paid for my own meals for years, adding my money to the household account for groceries that everyone ate from. I had paid for my own clothing, my own books, my own portion of utilities and internet, and the 100 small things that constitute a life. What I had not done was formalize these payments into an accounting. I had not walked into my father's domain and said, "I have contributed. I deserve to be counted." It took me 3 days to discover the trust. I found it because I had always been thorough about documents, because I had, in the course of my work, learned to recognize the particular language of financial instruments designed to hide money. I was cleaning out my grandmother Eleanor's papers. She had died the previous winter, and her estate was still being settled, when I found a file she had marked in her shaking handwriting. For Emily, for her future. Inside were copies of trust documents dated 15 years before, created when I was 11 years old. Eleanor had been a woman of considerable means. Her husband had been a successful real estate developer, and she had inherited her own family's wealth before that. She had loved me with the kind of clear-eyed attention that does not require expression. She had noticed things. She had seen how my father treated me differently than Andrew. She had watched me begin to shrink myself to fit the space I was being allotted. The trust was substantial. It had been set up as an educational trust, held in perpetuity for my benefit, with clear provisions that it could only be used for my education and professional development. The initial principal was $300,000. It had been managed by a trustee, a lawyer Eleanor had chosen carefully, with my father listed as one of 2 people with power of attorney over distributions. Had been, past tense. I held the documents in my hands and read them carefully, the way I had been trained to read financial instruments. The trust was real. The intent was clear. Eleanor had placed a condition on the funds. They were for me, exclusively, for my education. The provision was explicit. No other uses. No distributions to family members. No discretionary spending by the trustee without documentation that linked expenditure directly to my educational benefit. I did not cry. I had not cried in years. Somewhere around the time I realized that emotion was another commodity my family could not afford to acknowledge in me. But I felt something shift inside my chest. A kind of geological change in how I understood the architecture of my life. The next morning I called my Aunt Margaret. She arrived at my parents' house at 4 o'clock, using the key they had given her years ago, when she was still welcome in their inner circle without reservation. I was sitting in my room when she knocked softly on the door. I let her in and showed her the documents. She read them slowly, her face registering no surprise, only a kind of confirmation of something she had perhaps already suspected. "Your grandmother came to see me before she died," Margaret said quietly. "She asked me to keep watch, to make sure you were taken care of, if it ever became necessary. She said your father wasn't to be trusted with power over something he saw as yours, rather than his, to control." "Did you know he took the money?" I asked. I didn't know the specifics. But Eleanor was afraid of this. She came to me asking about trusts that couldn't be violated, protections that couldn't be circumvented. She was a sharp woman, your grandmother. And she knew Thomas. I pulled out my laptop and began accessing the financial records I had already requested. My father, as an officer of his company, had to file detailed disclosures. But this wasn't about public records. This was about tracing the money. My work, the work that had made me moderately valuable in the corporate world, was learning to follow money as it moved through systems, to understand that every transfer left a trace, every check, every wire, every deposit, was a kind of testimony. It took me 2 weeks of careful work. I pulled statements from accounts my parents maintained. I cross-referenced dates with my own records, times I had been hospitalized for what my mother called exhaustion, but what had been, in retrospect, something closer to a nervous collapse that no one had actually addressed. I was 19 when it happened. I had been working and studying simultaneously, carrying a weight I had never been asked to examine because asking would have required my family to acknowledge that I was carrying anything at all. The trust distributions had begun while I was in that hospital. My father had filed paperwork indicating that the funds were being distributed for my educational benefit, which was technically true if you interpreted my educational benefit to mean paying for Andrew's tuition at Cornell. The documents were signed by my father and bore my signature. Or rather, a signature that had been signed by someone other than me, possibly by my mother, in my father's presence. This is not as difficult as people imagine. A signature is just a shape. Once your parent has watched you sign enough documents, watched the way your hand moves, the pressure you apply, they can replicate it with reasonable precision if they are motivated to do so. The money had been transferred to an account my father controlled. From there, it had been distributed to Cornell directly, paid to a real estate firm for the condo down payment, distributed across various accounts. The theft, and I understood it was theft, understood it with the clarity that comes from my professional training, had been total and systematic and entirely legal in form, because all the paperwork bore the right names in the right places. I printed everything. I organized it into folders. I documented each transfer with the precision I had learned to apply to corporate fraud cases. Then I called an attorney. Her name was Patricia Hoffman, and she was a specialist in financial crimes and trust disputes. She came recommended by someone I knew through work, someone who had said, "If you need to go after someone, you need someone who understands that money is a language, and that language doesn't lie." I walked into her office with my documentation, and I laid it out methodically. I had prepared what I would say the way I prepared everything, with discipline, with order, with no emotional content beyond the facts themselves. Patricia listened without interrupting. She turned through the pages, checking dates, following the chain of transfers, nodding slightly as she began to see the architecture of what had been done. "Your father is going to deny this," she said finally. "He's going to claim family discretion, that he believed the funds should be used for the family's benefit, that you agreed to this arrangement." "I didn't," I said. "I have no record of agreeing to anything. My signature was forged." "Can you prove that?" "I can show that the distributions occurred while I was hospitalized and unable to sign documents. I can provide medical records, hospital discharge papers. I can show that I filed no paperwork indicating I understood what was happening. I have emails from my father from that time period discussing paying my tuition out of household funds, which suggests he knew that the trust money wasn't legitimately available for that purpose." Patricia smiled slightly. "You've done this before." "I do this for a living," I said, "only usually with companies instead of families. It's going to be difficult. Family cases are always more complicated than corporate ones. The law doesn't see money the same way when family is involved. But you have documentation. That's everything." I nodded. I had already known this would be difficult. What I had not known, until I saw it reflected in Patricia's expression, was how familiar it was. This kind of careful theft, this particular combination of access and authority, and the assumption that no one would actually have the training or the will to unravel it. I gave Patricia permission to begin proceedings. Then I went home, packed a single suitcase with my most essential belongings, and left before dawn the next morning. I did not write a note. I did not have a conversation. I simply drove north, toward Michigan, toward my Aunt Margaret's lakeside cottage, and tried not to think about how my hands were shaking, even though my mind was entirely clear. The cottage sat on a small lake about 40 minutes from town, accessible by a long driveway that wound through dense pine forest. It had belonged to my mother's family originally, before Margaret had claimed it as her own when it became clear that she was the only one who actually loved it. It was small and simple. 3 bedrooms, a wide porch, a stone fireplace that Margaret lit in the evenings when the temperature dropped. She had filled it with books, with comfortable furniture that had been chosen for actual use rather than appearance, with the kind of space that felt like rest rather than performance. Margaret had prepared a room for me without my asking. I understood then what my grandmother must have explained to her, what Eleanor had foreseen. When I arrived, Margaret simply said, "You can stay as long as you need," and then she made tea and left me alone. I spent the first week barely speaking. I set up my laptop in the corner of the living room, where I had a view of the lake. I finished the 2 remaining courses I needed for my forensic accounting certification. I attended virtual classes, completed assignments, recorded lectures, and moved through the mechanical process of education with the same careful discipline that had always characterized my choices. By the 2nd week, I had begun to establish a rhythm. Margaret would work during the day. She was teaching summer school, working with students who had fallen behind. I would work on my courses, but I had also begun to do something else. I had begun to document our family's financial life in a way I had never done before. Not out of anger. I've never been an angry person, and revenge, I discovered, is not actually what you want when someone has betrayed you. What you want is clarity. You want to understand exactly what was taken. You want to trace the shape of the theft so precisely that it becomes impossible for anyone, including yourself, to pretend it didn't happen. By the time the legal proceedings began, 3 months later, in the Wayne County Circuit Court, I had compiled a financial history of my family that would have made a forensic accountant weep. I had traced every dollar, I had established timelines. I had demonstrated not just the initial theft, but the pattern of decisions that had led to it. The prioritization of Andrew, the withdrawal of support from me, the calculated shift in how resources were allocated once I began to earn my own money. The trial itself was conducted with the kind of careful dignity that the American legal system extends to disputes over relatively large sums. We were neither criminals nor celebrities. We were simply a family with a financial disagreement, and the court would determine, through testimony and documentation, what was owed. My father's attorney argued that the trust documents had been unclear, that my father, as a trustee, had exercised reasonable discretion in allocating the funds toward family educational goals, that my father had in good faith believed the distributions were appropriate. This argument required a particular kind of rhetorical flexibility. It required claiming simultaneously that the documents were ambiguous, and that my father's interpretation was the correct one, that he had acted in good faith, and also that the forged signature was somehow not a forged signature, just a shorthand taken by someone managing family business. I testified for 3 hours. I answered questions about the documents, about the transfers, about my own educational expenses. I was asked whether I had ever authorized the use of trust funds for Andrew's education. I said no, and I provided the medical records proving I was hospitalized during the period when the authorization would have supposedly occurred. I was asked whether I had ever discussed with my father using the trust for anything other than my own education. I said no, and I provided emails demonstrating that our conversations during that period had been cursory and administrative. The court asked me about my relationship with my father, and I answered truthfully. We had a complicated relationship. I had always worked hard to make my family happy, but I had noticed, and I documented, in my professional capacity, that my father's priorities seemed to be organized in a particular way, that my needs, somehow, had been deemed less important than my brother's, that when resources became scarce, I was the one asked to sacrifice. Andrew did not testify in his own defense. His attorney advised against it, and he took that advice. Andrew was smart enough to understand that any words he offered would be examined under the same microscope we had already trained on our father, and he did not want that scrutiny. My mother did not testify either. She was asked to provide a statement about whether she had signed documents on my father's behalf. She said she had, but that she had not understood what she was signing. She said she had trusted my father to manage family finances appropriately. She said she loved me and had never intended harm. The judge's ruling was methodical and clear. The trust had been violated. The funds had been distributed contrary to the explicit terms of the document. My father, as trustee, had not exercised reasonable judgment. The signature on the authorization document was not a valid signature, and my father had been wrong to assume it was. Full restitution was ordered, $300,000 plus interest, plus penalties for misuse of a fiduciary position. There was also a referral to the Bar Association regarding my father's conduct. This was the part that actually seemed to wound him, more than the financial judgment. The financial judgment was an inconvenience, a redistribution of resources. But the referral suggested that his ethics, his fundamental professionalism, had been compromised. That was a categorization he seemed unable to accept. He appealed. The appeal took 6 months. During that time, I finished my certification, received my official credential, and began the work of establishing myself independently. I had already known that I needed to leave the life I had been living. The trial had clarified something I had perhaps always understood, that my family's version of normal was not normal, that the way I had been taught to make myself small and serviceable was not a virtue but a kind of voluntary erasure. I could not continue to be the person I had been while living in proximity to my family. The distance required was not just geographic but fundamental. I used part of the trust restoration to purchase a small house about 15 minutes from my Aunt Margaret's cottage. It was a modest place, built in the 1970s, with a small mortgage I qualified for easily based on my new professional credentials. The house had a good foundation, and that mattered to me. Appearances suddenly seemed far less important than actual stability. I opened my own firm, a small forensic accounting practice focused on helping individuals, particularly women, understand and protect their financial interests in cases of family fraud, divorce, and estate disputes. The work was good, and it was purposeful in a way my previous job had not been. I had been trained to spot the particular way that money could be weaponized by people in authority. It seemed worthwhile to use that training to help others see it too. Margaret helped me through this transition in the way she had always helped. Quietly, practically, offering presence more than advice. She would call in the evenings and ask how my work was going. She would occasionally invite me to dinner with her and her 2 daughters, who had both become formidable women in their own ways, and who welcomed me into their family without ceremony or question. My mother, in the aftermath of the trial, quietly filed for divorce. She did not do this out of any particular indignation at my father's behavior toward me. I think she had not entirely processed what had happened, but rather because the trial had cracked something in the careful performance she had maintained for so many years. She had been asked to account for her own actions, her own complicity, and she had realized that continuing to pretend everything was normal was no longer sustainable. She moved to Providence, where she had always wanted to live, and she began teaching art at a community college. She worked with adult students, mostly women, who were discovering that they had creative capacities they had never been permitted to explore. I would hear from Margaret that my mother was good at this work, that she had found something resembling purpose. My father retained his position at his law firm, though his practice became noticeably smaller. People in his social circle did not necessarily abandon him, but something had shifted. He became one of those men whose name carries a certain asterisk, about whom people exchanged knowing glances. He had been publicly disciplined by the Bar Association, a formal acknowledgement that he had used his position dishonestly. He did not appeal my case further. Eventually, he married a woman he met at his club, someone considerably younger than he was, and they moved to a house in Connecticut, away from the life he had built so carefully in Wellesley. Andrew, perhaps unsurprisingly, proved resilient. He had been young enough when everything unraveled that he could reimagine himself. He sold the condo my father's theft had purchased, a transaction that required me to testify about the origin of the funds. A moment that seemed to force Andrew to confront, for the first time, the way his advantages had been constructed. He moved to San Francisco, where he started working for a technology company in their finance division. From what Margaret heard through the family network, he seemed to be building something that was actually his own, unrooted from our father's influence. I had no particular feelings about this one way or another. He had been complicit primarily through blindness, through the choice not to question his own good fortune. That's not the same as active wrongdoing, but it's not innocent either. A year after the trial concluded, I stood on the porch of my own house, watching the light change as the sun moved toward the horizon. I had taken a younger woman, someone fresh out of her forensic accounting certification, as an apprentice. She had come to me with the particular haunted quality of someone who had seen financial manipulation up close. In her case, from a stepfather who had slowly and methodically drained her mother's savings, while everyone else pretended not to notice. I had hired her because I recognized something in her eyes, the capacity to see things that others would rather remain unseen, the willingness to do the hard work of documentation and truth. I was teaching her how to read financial documents the way a poet reads a text, not just for the obvious meaning, but for what's being concealed, what's being emphasized through repetition, what's being hidden in the particular choices about how information is presented. "Why is precision so important?" she asked me once. "I understand that it matters in legal proceedings, but you seem to think it matters for something else too." I took a moment before answering. I was still learning how to articulate the philosophy that had emerged from my own trial, from the experience of having my own life examined and re-examined through the lens of financial documentation. "Precision matters," I said finally, "because it's respect. When you tell someone's financial story accurately, when you refuse to simplify or dramatize, when you insist on the actual numbers and the actual timeline, you're saying, your experience matters enough to be told truthfully. You're refusing the story that would be more convenient or more satisfying. You're saying, These facts, these small, boring facts about money and signatures and bank transfers, these facts are what actually happened. And once you see what actually happened, you can't pretend you don't know it anymore. She nodded slowly, understanding, I think, that I was not actually talking only about accounting. I had learned something important from my family's story, something that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with inheritance. The money my grandmother left me was substantial, and I was grateful for it. It had allowed me to establish myself independently, to build work that was meaningful, to create the distance that was necessary for my own clarity. But the real inheritance was something simpler and more difficult. The understanding that I had the capacity to see what was being hidden, the discipline to document it, and the courage to act on that knowledge even when the cost was significant. Eleanor had anticipated this. She had known that I would need not just financial resources, but also proof that what I suspected was true. She had left me documents, left me the possibility of clarity, and left me, through Margaret, the assurance that there was at least one adult in my family who would believe me when I finally decided to speak. What I had built since then was not a revenge against my family, though I understand why it might look like that to outside observers. What I had built was a life organized around truth instead of performance. A home chosen for its actual qualities rather than its capacity to impress. Work designed to serve people who had been made invisible by their family's financial manipulations. A practice built on the principle that documentation, precision, and refusal to participate in comfortable lies were actually forms of respect. I mentored 3 other women that year, each of them learning the particular skill of seeing financial documents as evidence of intention. I won 3 cases on behalf of clients who had been systematically defrauded by people with power over their resources. I attended my Aunt Margaret's daughter's wedding, and I watched the bride commit to building a life with someone who had earned the right to that commitment through actual attention and care, rather than through the particular leverage that inherited confidence provides. I did not hear much from my father. Once a year, perhaps, Margaret would mention him in passing. His firm had gone through some restructuring. His practice was smaller. He had managed to avoid losing his license, though the Bar Association continued to monitor his work. He seemed, from a distance, to have become the kind of man who was obsessed with the past, with the way things had gone wrong, with finding someone to blame for the loss of the social standing that had once felt so important to him. I had no anger left for him. What I had was something more useful. The knowledge that I had been right to leave, that the truth I had fought for actually mattered, that documentation and discipline and refusal to participate in comfortable fictions were sustainable ways to live. On the anniversary of the day my grandmother had died, a day I had learned to mark quietly, without ceremony, I walked down to the lake near my house. The water was still, and the light was diffuse in the way it becomes in late autumn when the sun is lower in the sky. I thought about Eleanor, about the way she had known that I would need proof, that I would need documents, that I would need the kind of evidence that was difficult to dismiss. What she had given me was not just money, but the possibility of clarity. The trust had made it possible for me to walk away. But the documents she had left, the careful instructions to Margaret, the quiet confidence that I would be able to see what needed seeing, that was the real inheritance. I realized then that I had been wrong about one thing. I had thought, for a long time, that my greatest accomplishment had been surviving my family, that the trial and the documentation and the careful extraction of myself from their narrative was the peak of what I was capable of. But it wasn't. The peak was what came after. The ability to look back without regret, to use what I had learned to help others, to build a life that was actually mine. The table my grandmother had anticipated I would need to build was not a table designed for revenge. It was simply a table designed for honesty, a place where the facts could be laid out plainly, where nothing was obscured by sentiment or loyalty, where the truth was treated with the respect it deserved. I had built that table. I was building it still, each time I sat down with a new client and said, "I believe you. Let's look at the documents. Let's see what they say. Let's make sure that you are seen clearly, that your experience is recorded accurately, that the truth about what happened to you is preserved in a form that cannot be dismissed or reinterpreted." That was the inheritance I was passing forward.